Good morning.
Starting to get some good mornings and hellos coming in the chat.
Well, it looks like we've got most of you in here, so I'm going to go ahead and start. Just say hello. Hi, my name is Katie Hess. I am the current chair of RCWR. Thank you all for attending our webinar today. This webinar is part of a series that we're holding every month for all of 2021 called Hands-On: Practical Conservation for the Collections Professional. And we're just doing a bunch of webinars with a bunch of really talented conservators to try and give you all some great skills that you can use with your own collection. So I hope that you will join us for the rest of our webinars this year. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to my Vice Chair, Beth Sanders.
Good morning, afternoon, evening. I see we have people from all over the world here this morning, which is always really exciting. Thank you for the introduction, Katie, and welcome everyone to this webinar. Our sponsor for today's webinar is Gander & White. Gander & White Shipping has been handling fine arts and antiques with the utmost care and discretion for over 85 years, providing shipping and installation services to art dealers, private collectors, and museums around the world, with locations in New York, London, Paris, Miami, Palm Beach, and here on the West Coast in San Francisco and Los Angeles. Be sure to contact Gander & White for your upcoming projects. Thank you to Gander & White for being a Tier 1 sponsor of RCWR. And if you're not a member of RCWR, please consider joining today. Our membership runs on the calendar cycle, so if you haven't renewed yet for the year, it's a great time to do so. RCWR represents collections professionals in our 9 Western states as an affiliation of CSAAM, the Collection Stewardship Group of the American Alliance of Museums. In addition to this webinar series and hopefully future in-person events, we send out weekly emails with job listings and quarterly newsletters. We also have stipends available to apply for both regional and national conferences, whether they are virtual or in person this year. Membership is only $15 a year, so please join or renew today at rcwr.org. Today we are extremely fortunate to have Kathleen Daly Sligar with us. Kathleen has most recently worked for the Oregon Historical Society, but will be beginning a new position with the Oregon Military Museum shortly. Prior to OHS, she was a freelance registrar and textile specialist, managing internationally touring collections and regularly consulting on the management and care of textile objects throughout Oregon. She's been an Oregon Heritage Commission mentor since the program's inception in 2012, developed resources pertaining to the care of textile objects for the Oregon Heritage Commission, taught for 2 local universities, and served on the boards of both the Oregon Museums Association and the Registrar's Committee Western Region. She holds a BS in Merchandising Management and an MA in Fashion and Textile Studies, History Theory and Museum Practice, with a focus on textile conservation. Before I turn it over to Kathleen, just a few quick Zoom logistics. First of all, this is a webinar. Even though you can see Kathleen and I on the screen right now, we can't see you. Hopefully you're comfortable, maybe enjoying a cocktail if it's evening where you are. Otherwise, coffee or water, like me over here. But we do have both the chat and the Q&A function on the webinar today. You'll see there is a drop down at the bottom, so be sure to send your message to the audience you're intending to send to. So you have both the panelist options, which will just go to Katie, myself, and Kathleen, or the all attendees option, the panelists and attendees. So it'd be great if you want to say hello to everyone to switch that to the panelists and attendees. The Q&A feature is a great way to get those questions in so that we can get them all to Kathleen at the end of her presentation. If you have a technical question, we'll try to respond to it as quickly as possible. But if it's something about the content, we'll just catch those up and answer them all at the end. We are recording today's webinar and it will be posted on RCWR's YouTube page. So You can take a look on YouTube and search for the Registrar's Committee Western Region, or access the link from our website, rcwr.org, under the Workshops tab. It will take a couple days to get the recording up, but we'll have it there for your future reference. Share it with your colleagues, and we'll be very excited about that. Without any further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn off my camera and turn it over to Kathleen. Thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you so much for having me. Let's get started. I have so much material. It's not even funny. All right. So awesome. Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I accidentally looked at the number of people that are signing in, and now I'm a little nervous. So let's hopefully I can speak slowly for everybody here this morning for me. So welcome to Choosing the Right Stitch. I am going to talk about, just a handful of stitches that we as collections professionals should know. There's one in particular that I promise you is going to change your life. So hopefully you stick around for just that one stitch. And like Beth said, please do ask questions throughout the webinar. And I want to be sure to get to all of them at the end of the presentation. Let's see here. Okay, so Beth did a really good job of introducing me, so I'm not going to even bother with this slide. But what I will say is that this webinar is composed of my beliefs and my learned practices. So if you do any research on your own or seek professional guidance, which I highly recommend, just keep that in mind, that no two conservators are going to do the same thing the same way. Even myself with a project, I may do it one way the first time, and then the second or third time, I might choose to do something different. So it's very fluid. So do keep that in mind. Let's see. And I do encourage you to ask questions, because it is those questions that advance the field. And it's important for us to continually improve on our processes. So, mine isn't moving. That's okay. So today we'll start with some foundation work. Here's our overall agenda. I'd like to give a lot more information than probably what you think is necessary, but I really like us to all start on that same playing field. I think that helps us understand each other better, and it helps the material just kind of stick in your head more. Sorry, this is going to throw me off here for a moment. Hold on, my slides are not advancing on my screen. Okay. So I guess, Beth, since I'm a little discombobulated right now, why don't we do that poll really fast? And if you guys could just take a few moments here to answer these 3 questions. Again, this will help me get all of us, or help me to provide information that will get all of us on the same playing field.
We've got about 70% of our responses in already, Kathleen.
Thank you. I was just about to ask. It's like, I can't see anything. I guess while we just wait for those few last folks here, I will also add that my email address is at the beginning of this slide, or it's both at the beginning and at the end of this webinar. So please reach out. I am always available to answer questions, and I am always excited to help people complete projects. So please do reach out.
We've got just about everyone in. Kathleen, can you see the results?
I can't.
And let me press that. And I'm going to share the results, and everyone can see them.
Yay. All right. So can I control these results? Yes, I can. Okay. So we've got a lot of hand sewers. I love it. No, okay, okay. Okay, yay. Number 3, all those yeses, you guys are naughty, but we'll get to that. All right. So thanks everybody for taking a moment to do that for me. So ultimately, by the end of today's webinar, you should be able to identify the proper stitch and materials needed for a couple of textile collections-based applications. And ideally, the information presented should help you complete collections work more efficiently and help spread your dollar a little further. That's ultimately my goal as a collections professional, is to make that dollar spread. But most importantly, I hope you walk away with, and this is going to sound really funny, but I hope you walk away with the fear that's been struck in me as a conservator. That fear will help you complete any project correctly and safely so that future, and I'll add usually very costly conservation treatments can be avoided. So my number 1 objective for you today, aside from that stitch I was talking about earlier, is to learn to do no harm and to do what is reversible. All right. And if you can't remember that, then please just think of this. You don't want to be that person, and good intentions can cause a lot of issues. Okay. So this brings us to the Conservator's Code of Ethics. And this is really something that I will stress. I stress on a daily basis about this, and you'll hear me refer to it repeatedly today. And I really do believe that every museum professional should abide by this code of ethics. I think it should guide us in everything that we do professionally. And so I will actually spend a little bit more time on this slide than you may like. So first and foremost, show respect. All actions taken toward an object must be governed by an informed respect for the object. This is based on the idea that you must understand what you are working with in order to properly care for it. An object should be thoroughly studied prior to moving it or with moving forward with any actions. This understanding will help you plan. Do what is within your means and what is reversible. Working within your means is twofold. The first deals with safety, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But the second is to avoid assumptions of the parallels between everyday solutions and professional treatments. Just because you know how to quilt or you know how to sew, it doesn't mean that you know how to properly conserve or restore a hole in a historic textile. Although your repair may be reversible, the methods used may inflict additional damage, and that damage may not be seen for some time, but it's there. So it's important to practice within the limits of your personal competence and education. If you are not confident in your ability to perform something, then simply just don't do it. It's better to leave a problem for someone who is better trained than to attempt something that could result in more damage. And to continue to emphasize that concept, let's touch on reversibility. It's imperative that everything you do is reversible. Permanent change should only be done by a professional, if at all. And I know that using archival materials may sound like common sense, but trust me, it really isn't. And I'll talk more about this in a few moments, but we should always strive to select methods and materials that, to the best of our current knowledge, do not adversely affect cultural property or its future examination, treatment, or function. Document, document, document. I think this is really the most important thing to remember here with the Code of Ethics. And this includes, your display mounts and how you affix something to the display mount, for example. Every little aspect of your interaction with an object should be recorded. This should, of course, go in the database, and it should go in hard files, because these little snapshots in time allow future use to be able to look back. For example, if there's a discoloration on something, the documentation will help them potentially identify what that discoloration came from. And then, of course, always be safe. Being safe for yourself means that you're being safe ultimately for the object, which is very important. So to further build on that foundation, I just want to go through some terms. This is something I always do in all of my presentations, just so that we are all, again, on that same playing field. And we don't always understand the terms that we use. I like to call things Kleenex terms, because Kleenex isn't actually what it's called. It's called facial tissue, but we all use Kleenex. And so I really like to outline what we are all talking about when we are talking about them together. So ultimately, fibers are assemble together to create yarns. And a yarn can be something like a rope. Thread is technically a yarn. I know we like to think of something that is being knit or crocheted into a hat or into a scarf, but a yarn can also be a thread. It's any assemblage of fibers. And then those fibers and yarns are woven or knit to create fabrics and textiles. For the sake of today's webinar, I'm going to use the term textile to only refer to our historic objects. Fabric will be something that I refer to when I'm discussing our supply materials. So just keep that in mind. Textile is kind of this really fluid term now. It even encompasses fibers and yarns. So it's really important for today that you understand that textiles are going to be our historic objects and fabric is our supply material. And then just to supply a little visual here, again, those fibers are spun into a yarn, and then a yarn is woven or knit into a textile. All right. So now let's discuss some supply materials. Let's see. And I really want to talk about this before we get into anything else, because these supply materials create our environments for our textiles. And so they need to be chosen to be the appropriate materials because they ultimately are helping us preserve our collections. Again, we have more terms. The first three terms are especially important as we are all familiar with them, but they often are misused and misunderstood. So archival is used to describe a material that is chemically stable or inert and should not deteriorate. Acid-free is something that is pH neutral, but I'd like you to really focus on that second half of that line. They're pH neutral at time of manufacture. So there are instances where you will receive your material, and even though it's advertised as acid-free, by the time you receive the materials for use, it has become acidic. So the only way to really ensure that your material is acid-free is to also ensure that it's lignin-free. And if you'd like to learn more about lignin, I highly encourage you to go to the Oregon Historical Society's Dear Oregon blog. I've actually created a post on lignin and how to identify acid within materials. Let's see here. And then there's tooth and hand, which I'll use a lot today. And these components need to be considered when selecting your substrate material, your support fabrics. They work together to create just the right amount of friction for your textile so that they can easily be mounted and they won't move around. So when choosing supply materials for any collections project, there are several things you should take into consideration. And remember that textile objects are among the most sensitive items in museum collections. They have a particular vulnerability to light, humidity, and to temperature. So whatever we do needs to be as minimally invasive as possible. Again, to reiterate the code of ethics, we need to do no harm and we need to do what's reversible. So when working with textile-based objects, it's really important to take the time to study your object. And I like to personify my objects. So I say, listen to your object, talk to your object, take the time to get to know it. So first and foremost, check in with it. Ask, how are you doing? What are your condition needs? Are there any tears? Do you see loose thread? Is there any misalignment? Condition issues will determine and will ultimately guide you through your storage and display solutions. Continue the conversation with, what are you made of? If the textile is satin, for example, this will dictate a mounting substrate with a heavier tooth than a plain weave cotton, let's say. The heavier tooth will work with that satin to keep it in place. Additionally, are there any supplementary elements such as beading, fringe, buttons, for example? And what is the object's overall weight? Really take the time to provide a full assessment of the composition of your object. And then, how are you? How are you made, excuse me, how are you made? If the object is knit, for example, then that knocks out an entire storage solution. Knits should never be permanently hung as they're prone to sagging and stretching. The same goes for bias cut textiles and garments. This stretching can be permanent, so it's important to store these types of textiles flat. And unfortunately, since this is the reality in which we live, Exhibit designs and storage areas often have a larger say in the object's overall well-being than we'd like. And so this checklist can help you through any compromises that may need to be made. And I've included a resource here that's available online. Lucy has made an amazing document that can help you assess your objects, and it'll talk both about display and storage needs. And I highly recommend that you source this online and review it. Okay, and these are the materials that are most used for textile and garment care, and in particularly for mount making. In terms of textile-based materials, crepeline is first on the list here. If you can afford to have this on hand, I highly recommend it. Crepeline is a superfine silk fabric that is heavily used in conservation treatments. It's a plain weave, which basically means that it's the most simple of weave structures, making it really easy to unravel, which surprisingly is a bonus in this case, because you can actually unravel individual fibers to use it as thread. You can definitely buy that thread separate. It's called hair silk. But if you can buy the fabric and have both, then I highly suggest spending the money on the fabric. But crepeline can also be used, if you are more advanced, it can be used as a way to encapsulate your textiles too that are fragile. So then of course we have white and neutral tone cotton threads, which should always be in your arsenal, along with muslin, flannel, and jersey. These three textiles, you will hear me repeat their names so many times today because they are excellent in terms of mount making. Muslin, just like cotton thread, is the workhorse of the collection's care materials. It has so many different applications in general, and I highly recommend that this is something that you do keep on hand no matter what. Let's see here. Poly batting I'll get into much later, but you will see these two things repeated throughout, that it needs to be needle punched and it needs to be resin free. But like I said, I'll talk more about that in a few more slides. And then I won't discuss Tyvek today, but I really wanted to add it to this list just because it is another amazing fabric to have on hand. You can sew with it. It's water resistant. It's excellent for dust covers. It can also be used to create garment labels. So it's definitely another really handy material to have. And then our mount structures that we'll discuss today can either be made of board, either coroplast or blue board. And I prefer blue board as the edges aren't as sharp and it's easier to cut and to use hot glue with. And then stretchers, which are made of wood. So literally like what a canvas, an art canvas is stretched around. Okay, so when choosing supply materials, do your research. This is so important. It's important for all of us to know where our materials are coming from and what they are made of. Always make sure that you purchase your pieces from trusted vendors, and again, educate yourself about these purchases. When purchasing felted fabrics, or especially your poly batting, make sure your material is needle punched rather than thermal bonded. Thermal bonded materials are held together with an acrylic resin, whereas needle punched is literally just bonded with needles. So it's just pure polyester, if you will. If purchasing in person, this information can be found on the ingredients label on the side of the bag, and there's a little picture there of what that label looks like. And it can also be found at the end of the bolt. If you cannot find this information, then I highly suggest that you look for a different source. You really want to make sure that it is needle bonded and resin free. The same goes for muslin. Generally speaking, unbleached or neutral tone fabrics are ideal, but particularly in the case of your plain weave fabrics like muslin, you want to ensure that they're non-permanent press and unbleached. So again, we want the least adulterated fabrics to use with our textiles. Also, generally speaking, fabrics composed of cotton, polyester, or a blend of the two are most ideal. And there are exceptions to this rule, but for the sake of what we're discussing here, these are the three materials I will stress. And I highly encourage you to talk to a professional if you choose to use something other than one of these three. In terms of conservation stitching, we should be matching the composition of the thread to the textile. But again, for the sake of today's stitches, cotton thread is going to be our go-to, with the exception of hair silk. If you have hair silk, then have at it. But cotton thread should always be what we use. Absolutely do not use polyester, as it can actually slice through your fibers, which ultimately will destroy the integrity of your textile. Overall, all of our paper materials need to be acid-free and lignin-free, as I've discussed. Of course, your stretcher is made of wood. It's going to be filled with lignin. So just be sure that it's been lacquered and had enough time to dry and off gas. And then that last bullet is another resource that I highly recommend everybody to take a look at. It's the National Park Service's Conservagram on Safe Plastics and Fabrics. I don't like to commit a lot of things to memory. I like to have quick guides to go to. And this is one that I always have next to my desk. So with those considerations in mind, we can now prepare. We went over this in previous slides, so I hope you appreciate how important preparation is. But first and foremost, always start with that consultation. Consult with your object, look at your resources in terms of documentation and in terms of personnel, and always ask a professional. Again, my email has been made available. Contact me unless you have someone else that, that you trust and like to go to regularly. When preparing supply fabrics, always do a double wash, once with a neutral detergent like Orvis, and then the second with just water. When you dry, do not use dryer sheets, just use air. Just use your tumble dry. So literally you're going to be washing your fabric with just water, Orvis first, water, and then you're going to dry just air. And prepare to document. Again, we want those little snapshots in time. Okay, finally, some stitches, yay. I haven't mentioned this, but I kind of alluded to it with little poll, but sewing machines should never be around historic textiles. They're only meant for our supply materials and nothing more. So never, ever bring a historic textile near a sewing machine. You should only be using hand stitching. So with that in mind, let's talk about some general rules. These guidelines should not only help you abide by our code of ethics, but in doing so will also help to avoid future costly professional treatments. These two photographs help demonstrate why these rules of thumb are so important and why we need to remember our mantras of doing no harm and doing what is reversible. Excuse me. So clearly someone had the best of intentions when they were trying to repair this garment, but their repairs actually led to more damage, and in doing so caused some really harrowing stitch removal. As with anything else, practice makes perfect, especially for those who haven't stitched before. So for anyone that plans to perform any of the stitches we cover today, I cannot encourage you enough to create a stitch sampler or a notebook. And not only will this force you to practice the stitch techniques, but once you've completed these techniques, you can actually have a nice visual that you can refer back and forth to when needed. And again, my email address, if you want help with any critiques on these stitches, please email me a photo. I am more than happy to help guide you through that process. And something else we never want to do here is knot our thread. So again, all of you naughty knot tires, we have a stitch for that, and I will show you. That will be our first stitch that we go over. But there will be one caveat. There is one stitch that requires a knot, but other than that, we do not use knots. And you can see here why. That knot and the associated stitch work actually aided in that entire tear and the tear extension. So that leads me to the next bullet on our slide, which is, which is light, not tight. You ultimately want to create the Goldilocks of stitches, all right? You don't want your stitch to be too tight. You don't want it to be too light. It needs to be just perfectly laid across your textile. That when pulling too tight, it can actually create a misalignment, and it can also, as in this example, create a new separation in your fibers. So here we see some of that puckering because of stitching that was just completed too tight. When we start talking about storage and display mounts, sewing with the grain of your textile is also going to become very important. And you can see here how stitching against the grain actually caused not only some strange hole in the repair, but it also aided in some additional puckering that continued along the arm's eye. When sewing, it's also important to make sure that your needle is positioned between the yarns of your textile and not through the yarns. By sewing through the yarns or through the weave, you are creating a potential, by sewing literally through the yarns, excuse me, you're potentially damaging your textile. So always make sure that that needle goes in between the physical items. You want it to go in airspace. As stated, white or neutral tone threads need to be used. Cotton, 100% cotton should be your thread composition. And practice makes perfect. And that also goes with the even and consistent stitches. And again, this is something that you'll want to practice on your stitch sampler or in your notebook. By having these stitches that are even and consistent, you are helping the weight and the stress of being stitched onto a mount be evenly distributed. When labeling textiles, you want to select a consistent location that is difficult for the public to see, but easy for you to find. Again, by knowing where to look, you never have to overhandle an object. Interior seams are the most ideal areas with garments. Never use existing holes or existing areas of damage. Buttonholes, zippers, buttons should also be avoided, as well as any supplementary elements. So the beading, fringe, anything that's been added to your textile. Let's see. Again, the number one thing here to remember is that if in doubt, do nothing. Again, you don't want to cause any permanent damage. And this last bullet, again, is another online resource. I've actually taken the images from this online resource for consistency and placed them in my slide presentation, just so that it'll be exactly the same when you actually reference this resource. And this is, thank God for them. This is something that I used in grad school and something that I always share with individuals who want to learn conservation stitching. It's really the go-to reference. So please do review it online. Oh, and one added thing here too is that there are so many videos on YouTube that help you learn how to stitch. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the actual stitches themselves. I'd rather spend that time on their applications, as that information isn't readily available. And I will have handouts that will be provided for you so that you can reference this webinar, your notes, and those handouts to really make a complete project. So the first and most important stitch is the tailor's tack. This is the stitch that works in lieu of the knot. And if you walk away with anything, this should be the stitch. This stitch is extremely easy to master and it's easily removed. You just have to pick it out with your needle. It can be completed with a single thread or a double thread. And you can see here in the illustration that it's been doubled. But really a single thread is going to be completely fine. And not only can this tack be used to knot or to create temporary stitches, but it should be used to attach your object ID labels to your textiles and garments. This should be the only stitch you use. Again, it's not only easily removable if needed, but the amount of textiles you'll be able to label in any given day is going to multiply. The stitch is so incredibly fast. As you can see in the image, the stitch is only completed along two sides. So you no longer have to complete a running stitch around the entire perimeter. It's literally 2 or 3 stitches on one side, 2 or 3 stitches on the other side, and you're done. And even more ideal is if you have hanging storage, if you apply this to your interior cuff of a sleeve or into the interior cuff of a pant leg, you can actually dangle the tool tape out of the sleeve or pant leg and just attach the object ID label along one edge. That way you won't have to touch the object. You can simply just see the object ID number. And during display, you can just simply tuck it into the sleeve or cuff and it'll be out of view. Again, huge time saver. So let's see if I can get a little arrow on the screen here. I can. Okay. So just really quick regarding the tailor's tack, you'll want to insert your needle just like this along one side. You need to be sure to only go through one layer of your textile. That's why the cuff area or a hem is perfect because you have two layers to work with and you don't want to see that white thread on the face of your object. So after pulling the needle through that section, going on to the next image here, and I know this is a little blurry, I'm sorry, you're just going to use those same two holes to repeat that stitch. And you're gonna do it 2 or 3 times and you're gonna cut your thread and you're done and you can go to the other side. Super easy. The next stitch in our arsenal is going to be the herringbone stitch, which is used for flat mounts. This stitch is used throughout the surface of a textile to provide an even distribution of weight across the support fabric. When practicing the stitch, you'll want to make sure that the space between 2 and 3, so right here, is as short as possible, as that area is going to be seen on the face. The length between points 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 will depend on the size of your textile, but generally speaking, for most applications, you'll be looking at, right around an inch, 3/4 of an inch to an inch. The overcast or whip stitch is used in tandem with the herringbone stitch for flat mounting. It's used to secure the edge of your textile into place once your herringbone stitches are complete. This is one where you will want to pay special attention to the grain of your textile, keeping the vertical stitch as parallel to the grain as possible. Again, the length of the stitch will vary depending on the size of your textile, but generally speaking, it's going to be about 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 inch. The knotted stab stitch is used when applying a slat and sleeve system or a VELCRO support system. And that system is used to hang quilts or other large flat textiles. It's not only the exception in regards to being the stitch that uses a knot, but it's also the stitch that, or the system, excuse me, that uses a sewing machine. And I'll talk more about that later, or in the next slide, I think. The key here is keeping that distance between 1 and 2 as short as possible, because that's where you're going to actually create your knot. So you don't want it to, you only want it to be a couple, 3 or 4 of yarns wide maybe. So this is that example that I'm talking about. This is your VELCRO support system. So the loop side of the VELCRO, and just a little tidbit here, VELCRO is that Kleenex term. The actual material is called hook and loop tape. And if you actually look at VELCRO, you'll see one side is a bunch of hooks and one side is a bunch of loops. And this is that loop side of your VELCRO. This will, excuse me, that VELCRO will be stitched around the perimeter onto your backing. And in this case, it's a piece of twill tape. Once it's stitched, and it'll be machine stitched onto that piece of twill tape. And you'll reinforce it at both ends, as you can see here. Once it's stitched onto the twill tape, then pretending that this piece of muslin is my quilt, you will use that knotted stab stitch to attach your strip to the textile. And what's important here is that you will use the holes that the machine stitching created for you. So that'll be extremely helpful considering the thickness of the VELCRO. And as you can see, I've knotted every other stitch. And that knot is simply created by threading your needle through your thread's loop as you sew. All right. And then lastly, we have a couch inlaid stitch. And this stitch is can be used to keep loose fringe or loose yarns on your textile into place when being mounted. When implemented, the stitch should only be used to pierce your support fabric, never your actual textile. These illustrations depict more closely placed stitches than what would be preferred. But most importantly, what I want you to note, and it's on this lower one here, is that the stitches are off center as you move through your vertical stitching, through your horizontal stitching. That'll make more sense on the next slide here with my amazing diagram for you. So say I'm trying to mount this textile, this guide on, and it has all of that fringe. So what you'll do is that you will take, your neutral colored yarn, you'll take a length and you'll spread it across, depending again on the size of your textile, you're going to spread it across several of the loose elements, and you're going to tailor's tack it into place on both ends. And then in this case, I just want to create a short little stitch every 4 or 5 pieces of tassel, pieces of fringe. And that will help keep them in place while the object is on display. And for this piece, I think, probably 3, these should have been more evenly spaced, but 3 horizontal stitches along the entire perimeter of the guidon's fringe would help keep that fringe aligned. Okay, so let's talk about some more applications now. In general, textile should not be on display for more than 6 months. And I'm sure all of you just laughed out loud, and I totally get it. A year max is really what most of us will want to shoot for. It's still longer, obviously, than what is ideal, but it is a little bit more realistic. So with that in mind, when planning exhibits, do try to find ways to rotate textiles off exhibit. Perhaps you use 2 textiles and you have one on display for 6 months, you rotate it out, you let it rest for 6 months, and while another object is on display. Do try to plan, because it is something that will help preserve these textiles for posterity, which is ultimately what we're trying to do here. Part of preventive conservation is regular cleaning. So before and after an object goes on display, do be sure to give it a vacuum, and I'll provide a handout that provides guidance on vacuuming if needed. And something that I think has really helped me as a professional is to always consider the display space a temporary storage space. That way, whatever I do at back of house has to apply at front of house. And not only can that help in terms of cost saving measures, because it does force you to be a little bit more creative, but it will also help the object maintain its durability. So these 2 methods, the flat mount and the covered board, are 2 methods for displaying flat textiles, and where conservation stitching can and should be used when needed. These mounts provide complete support for flat textiles, and in some cases can also be used as a textile storage solution, which is so ideal, especially for fragile pieces or pieces that are regularly used. These boards should be made out of coroplast or blue board, as I've discussed, and of course those materials are archival and acid-free. If a mount is only being used for display, then that's where a stretcher can be utilized instead. Objects overall should not be stored long-term on their stretchers, however. Excuse me. This image here illustrates a caveat in a sense, because it is the object is mounted on a plexi mount. Originally, this guidon was attached to a plexi mount with earth magnets, but the earth magnets weren't used in an appropriate manner. And instead, we decided to just turn it into a padded mount. And so we applied poly batting and flannel and conservation stitched the guide onto the mount. It's not pretty, but it's definitely a lot more, it's a lot safer for the object, and it's definitely going to help the object overall. Let's see here. Okay, so again, I just really want to touch on the importance of the substrate material, the show fabric. These, again, flannel muslin jersey, should be a neutral color. If a colored fabric is preferred, do seek professional guidance. You want to make sure that you do a color fastness test because moisture does happen in displays, whether you like it or not. There is moisture, and dye migration can potentially be very dangerous for objects and permanent. So do be sure to seek guidance if using a non-neutral color. So working from the innermost material to your object, these are the layers which compose a flat mount, starting with the backer. Again, I've discussed the materials that we're using. Flat mounts, you're only going to be using a stretcher. For covered board, it's going to be coroplast or blue board. On top of that, you're going to have your support fabric, which for the case of a stretcher is going to be a flannel support fabric. And for a covered board, it's going to be a piece of needle punched batting that is cut to size. Placed over that fabric is going to be the show fabric, and that's essentially creating the background for your object. And again, it's the trifecta here. And we've gone over this, so I'm not going to bore you anymore with that. And then finally, you have your object. This is an example of a covered board. So literally, I have a piece of blue board here that has a piece of cotton or poly batting cut to shape, and then placed within this muslin sleeve. And then I've literally just overcast the muslin sleeve closed. Here we have a diagram, and I'll make sure that this diagram is included on a handout for you. But this shows you the stitching that I used to attach this fabric or this textile, if you will, to this covered mount. Do take note that there should be at least 2 more horizontal lines on this illustration. This illustration has been completed kind of mid-project, if you will. But basically, to attach this textile to the mount, I started from the center edge of the textile. So in this case, it was this green band. I herringbone stitched all the way across. All right. After that initial stitch, I assessed the textile to make sure that it was still in the correct position, that there weren't any warps, that it was still aligned. And then I continued with a line of herringbone stitching, and you can kind of see my puckering because some of my stitches were too tight. This is a reason why you don't want too tight of stitching. But I created that line through the center of the cream area and then through the center of the blue area. Once I was done, I flipped my mount 90 degrees, and then I created the same herringbone stitch, again, starting from the center, a herringbone stitch to the center here, and then along through the center of the remaining 2 margins. Once completed, then you can continue with your overcast stitch. And again, that's along, why don't we flip images here? That's along the edge, and that helps keep the textile flat. All of these stitches together really, again, contribute to that even distribution of stress for your textile so that not any one element of your textile is being overly stressed at one time by being mounted onto this board. I won't be able to get into this storage method, but I really wanted to share it with you because a covered board can easily be turned into a sink mount. And this method is efficient with space as you can easily establish standard sizes for mats depending on the boxes that you use for your storage. Once utilized, this mount basically eliminates the need to physically touch an object ever again. And the board can actually be used as its carrier. You can use it for display. And also, because nothing is coming in contact with your textile, you can actually stack several of these within a box, eliminating a lot of wasted vertical space. And I'll have a handout again to provide more information on how to construct these. This is like the most amazing thing for collections professionals, I think, is this type of mount. So here's an example of a temporary display mount using that stretcher that I've been talking about. When constructing the stretcher, make sure your support fabric and show fabrics are as tight as possible. You'll first wrap your flannel, and as you can see here, here's my flannel support fabric. You're going to, this is a little tricky to explain here, but you're going to begin at these centers. You're going to first staple close to the outer edge, your flannel. You're going to pull it taut and do the same on the opposite edge. You're going to flip it 90 degrees, and you're going to do the same with the left and right. And you can kind of see my staples underneath the muslin here. You want to make sure that you have enough room for both sections of stapling. Once you've managed to get that as tight as possible, then you're going to do the same with your show fabric, starting from the centers and then working outward. And you'll want to make that edge as clean as possible. And it takes a lot of practice to kind of get this down to an art, but it's a lot of fun. And I really recommend building these from hand when you do have the opportunity to. Here you can see where kind of where I've made my stitches, and I've actually used hair silk for this. So you can see how fine that that fiber is. It really is ideal for display mounting. Because of the size of this textile, we'll go back here, I only used a herringbone stitch across the center here and the center vertical. There are only 2 lines. And then I finished with that overcast stitch on the edge. A backer should also be used with stretchers just to keep dirt away from the reverse and to protect that open space in the back. This typically is done with honeycomb graphics board or gator board. Just do keep in mind that gator board is acidic, so it could be, even though it's easier to work with, it could be better to build a spacer with blue board and or ethafoam. And if you do use ethafoam, do make sure that you use a hot iron to smooth it so that it can't accidentally affix to your stitches on the reverse of your textile. All right, I think I actually flew through that, which was good because there was a lot of information in a short period of time. Ultimately, I hope you're able to glean a little bit of insight into some of the conservation stitching and their applications. But most importantly, I want to remember to do what is reversible and to do no harm. So again, if in doubt, please do nothing. Consult a professional. Email me. I'm always happy to help. I know I've said that a million times, but it's true. And most importantly too, remember to choose quality materials. Those materials are contributing to the environment of your textile, and we're here to preserve those textiles. So we need to be choosing the right materials accordingly. All right. Question time.
We do have a few questions that have come in. The first one came in fairly early in the presentation with regard to the needle punched poly batting. And she asked about where on the label it says that it's needle punched. So I was wondering if you could speak about the ingredients.
Sure. So I feel like, and I'm sorry, I'm like fumbling through this now here. I feel like companies have gotten better with printing it on the front, but there literally is this black printed box somewhere on the bag. And if it contains resin, it will say in this box, oh, here we go. It'll say white polyester fiber, and then it'll say resin right next to it. So if you only see polyester fiber, then you know that you have a needle punched material. I hope that answers that.
It does. The next question was asking for a review on what the herringbone stitch was used for. And that one came in right as we were going through the stitches. So perhaps they've understood, but if we could quickly refresh.
Sure. So the herringbone stitch is used to actually mount your textile to the support fabric. So it's going to keep your, it's going to keep your textile into place. And it actually, it helps distribute weight and stress across the support fabric instead of your textile. So it's a way of alleviating weight, if you will.
Would you recommend a shorter display time for textiles like rugs and blankets if they use vegetable-based dyes? And the question specifies that lighting is set at a maximum of 50 lux.
I think that 6-month period is really the key. Anything, as long as you're following all of the perimeters of, displaying a textile, and that 50 lux is absolutely spot on, by the way. So yes, that's fantastic. As long as the environmental conditions are fine, then again, that 6-month period, I think, is what you should be shooting for, especially with something as fragile as that.
I'll follow up to that. I know a lot of us have covered up some of our more sensitive objects or taken them off display, but they're still on their mounts perhaps during these long-term closures. Mm-hmm. Would you extend the amount of time that you would approve for a display given the limiting of light?
Oh, definitely. And that's really the key there, is that when something's on display, you're introducing so many different agents of deterioration. There's the fact that you have lighting, the fact that you have traffic, the fact that traffic is then creating more dust and particulate and vibration. And so since we are closed, since so many of us, I should say, are closed right now, it's definitely okay to extend those periods. I will say that the catch here is textiles that are on mannequins, so garments. I would recommend that, and what a huge headache, and I get it, but again, we're here for the objects, we're not here for ourselves. If you know that, and actually we don't know, none of us know how long we're going to be closed, but I would highly recommend removing any garments from mannequins right now and letting them lay flat or hang until you're going to be open, and then redress those mannequins. But in terms of covered board and any flat mounts, if possible, I would remove them from the wall if they're not on a 45, just so that they can rest flat while we are closed.
Thanks. We next had a few questions about the possibility of using linen for mounting textiles.
As the support fabric, definitely. Linen is also a very good option.
Okay, then we have someone who said they were taught to stitch all the way around a label to reduce the risk of something like a finger getting caught behind the label and yanking it out of the piece, potentially tearing the textile. What is your opinion on this? Does the loose stitching and the lack of a knot reduce that risk significantly?
So it's actually not a loose stitch at all. The tailor's tack is an extremely secure stitch, and again, I don't believe in knots. They shouldn't be used. And I suggest you just trying the tailor's tack. Do your own sample, use it on a piece of muslin, and just tack the label onto the muslin and try pulling it off. You'll see how tight the stitch actually is. And in my career, I have never once had an issue with accidentally pulling a label. That's something that I've never heard of. And I definitely understand the safety, and I think that's amazing and that's awesome to have that level of awareness. But especially if you know exactly where the labels are going to be, like they're always in the cuff, then you shouldn't have that fear. I'm probably being a little blasé, but that's definitely something that I don't think you should be wary of.
Just point out in case you didn't see it that Nicole commented in the chat that you taught her the tailor's tack and it changed her life. So Diana asked, when stitching through a textile with a herringbone or other stitches, are there any fabrics you wouldn't stitch through?
Oh, one more time, please.
When using the herringbone or any other stitches, are there any fabrics you should not stitch through?
If I'm understanding the question correctly, I'm understanding it to ask, are there any textiles that should not be stitched through? Again, historic textiles. And yes, definitely. If you have, and thank you for asking that. If you have a textile that is in poor condition and is embrittled, then that is a textile you should never stitch through. So for example, the guidon that I showed earlier, it was extremely brittle. The silk was shattered and it was just splitting everywhere. That would never be sewn through. That actually needs professional treatment. And if I were to display that piece, I would actually use the crepeline that I was discussing to create an overlay. And I would cut the crepeline to size and then stitch it around the textile so that it could be encased. So thank you. Thank you so much for asking that question.
We have a question from Maureen, who's wondering what you see as an advantage of conservation stitching versus using insect pins for exhibition mounting.
Oh my God. So I don't even know where to go with that question. That's a great question. Pins just should never be used. And hopefully too, if you are using entomology pins, those insect pins, I hope that you are washing them first. Because they do have, I don't remember right now, but there is some sort of material on the exterior that needs to be washed prior to using them with textiles. So please be sure to do that. You know, entomology pins are very fine, but ultimately the stitching distributes that weight. I know that that's hard to grasp as a concept. It took me a while to really come to terms with it, but stitching is just supplying so much more support than those pins. And, you know, you can easily forget that a pin is in it and it could cause damage. If moisture is introduced, it could cause damage. You know, I don't really know how to answer that just because pins are something that to me should always be avoided and there's never an exception with that. Sorry, I can't provide a better answer.
What kind of needle do you use, curved or straight?
I use both, and I've actually, I've had a hard time finding curved needles. They're definitely available, and I highly recommend curved needles. You know, the finer, the better. But if you don't have access to a curved needle, you can just take a beading needle, which is one of my favorites. I like sharps and beading needles, but you can heat them and then curve them yourself.
And there was a similar question about what kind of needles you prefer, blunt or sharp, and if there's a specific gauge.
Ooh, I wish I could answer the gauge question. I actually meant to look that up for everybody and I didn't. But you do just want a finer gauge for most cases. But then again, just remember that the finer your needle, the more easy it is to pierce the yarn rather than go through the weave of the textile. So there is more care that is involved with using a finer needle. But ultimately, you know, if you find a curved needle, I say use the heck out of that thing because those things are gold.
Is there any difference in the type of needle that you would use for sewing on labels versus?
You know, for labels, I just prefer a standard sewing needle, just a straight needle. But no, a curved needle would be just as fine.
Does the wood in a stretcher need to be of a specific kind or treated in a special way?
So just like any other wood that you might have in your collection, it needs to be, you need to have those 3 layers of lacquer. Ideally, if you can use a stretcher that's made out of the lighter woods, so I believe poplar and ash are 2 of the least acidic woods, then that would be ideal. But I haven't really been able to identify wood materials in stretchers. And so, the lacquering is really the key there.
Then we have 2 questions about your thoughts on pressure mounting textiles behind Plex for temporary or permanent storage.
So I was hoping I wouldn't have to answer this question. I don't believe in pressure mounting. And again, that goes back to, every conservator has their own preference. In grad school, I actually used several pressure mounts, and they're great. They absolutely are great. I just think that there's a lot of potential for damage if not done right. And so if you have a professional conservator that will pressure mount it for you, and they're a trusted professional conservator, then I say go for it. But a DIY, I would always suggest never do that yourself. But overall, I just would opt for another option.
Do you stitch the object to the show fabric before affixing it to the stretcher?
So thank you. I'm glad that you've asked that question, because you're probably not going to be the only person who's wondered that. Always create your mount first, so that support fabric and that show fabric need to be on the mount, secured and as tight as possible. And then you're going to apply your textile to it.
And we have a question about using poly cotton threads, or should we only use 100% cotton?
100% cotton.
And I apologize if anyone can hear my dog barking in the background. Apparently someone's at my door. What about matching the color of what is your opinion on using cotton poly thread that is color matched to a textile for display?
So that's okay. So there are exceptions. There are always exceptions. I like to say never all the time, but there are always exceptions. The only exception I can see for that would be if you are creating a Velcro support system for a more modern quilt, and for a fact what the composition of your quilt is. Overall, I don't think there really is a need, and again, there's going to be an exception, but I don't think there is a need to have a colored thread. If you're doing your stitching correctly, you can totally get away with just using the 100% cotton that's a neutral tone, and you can go a little bit darker than just an unbleached type of color. But you can get away with 100% cotton neutral tone thread, or with the hair silk. There really are going to be few applications, I think, in terms of what we are doing here today. There are going to be few applications. Again, if you are a professional conservator, then that opens a whole other door. But for us, 100% cotton and the hair silk.
Okay, just got a few more questions that we'll take. For the piece on the blue board, are you attaching? Oh, well, this is sort of the same thing as our other question about the stretcher. Are you attaching the show fabric to the board first and then stitching to the show fabric? So we've answered that one already. We have a comment about linen, how it often smells of linseed oil, even after washing, and can transfer to the textile. Were you talking about bleached linen?
I have never heard of that. I don't know how to answer that question. That's never been brought up before. And I because of that, I don't feel like that's a concern. If you would like to pursue that with other professionals, then I highly recommend doing so. But that's definitely not something that's ever been put on my radar. But just like any other show fabric and support fabric, definitely wash it before using.
And we'll do one more, and then if there are other questions, because some keep coming in, we will put your email address back on the screen, and attendees can feel free to reach out with those questions. but just one question. Do you recommend removing the Velcro or muslin strip after the piece is done being exhibited?
I think that's a personal preference. I think if there's a potential that the piece will be on display again, then leave it. It's not hurting anything when you place the textile back into storage, as long as it's resting safely with the object, as long as it will curve and fold with your textile, then I say leave it. What's the point of doing something more than once? But if you don't see any potential for that object being placed back on display, then I'd say remove it and you can reuse it for another textile.
Okay, well, I will take your screen off and put mine back up. So thank you again, Kathleen, and thank you to all of you for really, really fantastic questions and joining us this morning. Hopefully you've learned some new skills that you can bring back to your institutions and collections. So before we go, I wanted to announce our next two upcoming webinars. First, on February 18th, we'll have Madison Brockman, who's an Andrew W. Mellon Fellow at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, who will be discussing proper handling and storage enclosures for fragile paper objects. And then on March 18th, Rosa Lowinger of RLA Conservation will discuss cleaning soot off of artifacts, which is particularly relevant for those of us in the Western region in wildfire-prone areas, but also important for anyone's disaster recovery training. I know Katie put the link for our February registration into the chat, so you can go there and click on that. But we also have it up on our website, and we'll be sending it out through the same methods we sent out this one. I'm going to put mine and Kathleen's contact information back up here. If you have any further questions, I know there were just a few we didn't get to this morning, but trying to respect everyone's time. But also, if you have other ideas about future webinars or programming or questions about RCWR, reach out to myself or Kathleen. We also would love it if somebody who was in attendance today wanted to write about what they learned and how they plan to bring it back to their own institution. So if that sounds like you, also send me an email. But otherwise, we are so grateful that you all joined us. Thank you again, Kathleen, and we look forward to seeing you all in February.
Thanks so much, everybody.